Which one of you is Mrs. Carter?
I am. No, I am.
Neither woman knew the other existed, and the only man who could explain it wasn't waking up to answer. It's just after midnight in a hospital emergency room, and Diane Carter is running down a hallway that smells like antiseptic and fear, still wearing her house slippers because she didn't stop to change them. Her husband has been hit by a car outside their apartment building, and the man on the phone told her to come quickly, so she left everything and drove faster than she has ever driven in her life. She reaches the waiting area outside the ICU, breathless, and that's when she sees another woman already sitting there, a woman she has never met, a woman who is crying harder than Diane is, gripping a tissue like it's the only solid thing left in the room. Diane assumes she's a coworker, maybe a nurse from his practice. Then a doctor walks over, looks at both of them, and asks a question that will end one version of Diane Carter's life and begin another. Which one of you is Mrs. Carter? Both women raise their hands. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 22 years, Diane Carter believed she knew everything about the man she married. She knew his coffee order, the side of the bed he slept on, the exact tone of voice he used when he was lying about being tired instead of admitting he'd had a hard day at the hospital. She did not know that 3 hours south, in a modest brick house in a different state, there was another woman who believed exactly the same things about the exact same man. She did not know that woman's name was Patricia. She did not know Patricia had 2 children who called this man Dad on weekends. He claimed he was working overnight shifts. And she certainly did not know that in a matter of hours, standing in a hospital corridor under fluorescent lighting, she would learn all of it at once, from a stranger, while the man responsible for all of it lay unconscious 2 rooms away, unable to explain a single piece of it. Dr. Thomas Carter was, by every account that existed before that night, a good man. Ask his patients and they'll tell you about the physician who remembered their kids' names, who called personally to check on test results instead of leaving it to a nurse, who sat with families in waiting rooms long after his shift technically ended. Ask his neighbors and they'll describe a quiet, reliable presence who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and waved from his car. Nobody who knew Thomas Carter in either of his 2 lives ever used the word we'd expect for a man about to be unmasked as living a double existence. Nobody called him calculating. Nobody called him cold. What they called him, over and over, in 2 different states, to 2 different families, was dependable. And that word, more than any other, is exactly what should worry you as this story unfolds. Thomas met Diane first, back when they were both 24, at a mutual friend's engagement party in the city where they both grew up. She remembers him as quiet in a room full of loud people, the kind of man who listened more than he talked, which she mistook, understandably, for depth. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony that her mother planned almost entirely, because Thomas said he didn't care about the details as long as she was happy. It should have been a small warning sign how easily he let other people make decisions for him. Instead, it read as easygoing. They bought a house in a quiet suburb. They had 2 children. Thomas finished his residency and built a private practice with a waiting list 6 weeks long. From the outside, and frankly from the inside too, it looked like the kind of marriage people point to as proof that good things happen to good people. What Diane didn't know is that 4 years into their marriage, Thomas's medical rotations began sending him on stretches of overnight coverage at a satellite clinic 3 hours away. He explained it as a hospital system quirk, a rural outreach program that rotated doctors through underserved counties. It was, in fact, mostly true. There really was a clinic. He really did cover shifts there. What Diane didn't know was that on one of those rotations, in a diner near the clinic at 2 in the morning, Thomas met a nurse named Patricia, and something about being somewhere no one expected him to be made him feel, for the first time in years, like a man without a script. He didn't tell her he was married. He let her assume, correctly by every document she'd later see, that he was single. That was the first lie. It would not be the last. Patricia was 29, recently out of a difficult relationship, working double shifts to pay off nursing school loans she'd never quite gotten ahead of. She has said, in the only interview she ever gave about any of this, that Thomas felt like relief. He didn't want anything from her except her company on the nights he was in town. He listened the way people listen when they've had practice, which she also mistook for depth. Within a year, he was staying at her place whenever his rotation brought him through. Within 2 years, he'd quietly filed paperwork that, according to what he told Patricia, ended a previous marriage that hadn't worked out. Patricia never saw a signed divorce decree with her own eyes. She had no reason to ask for one. Why would she? The man in front of her was a respected physician with nothing to hide, except, of course, that hiding things was the one skill he'd apparently mastered better than medicine. In 1996, Thomas Carter married Patricia in a small courthouse ceremony in her home state, using a copy of a divorce filing that investigators would later determine had never actually been finalized and may never have been properly filed at all. Diane Carter, 3 hours north, remained fully and legally his wife. She had no idea a second marriage certificate with her husband's name on it existed anywhere in the world. For the next several years, Thomas ran 2 entire households the way some men run 2 entire careers, compartmentalized so completely that neither woman ever crossed paths with the other's world. 2 Christmases, 2 anniversaries, 2 sets of school photos on 2 different refrigerators. He was, by every account, present and attentive in both homes, which raises the question that sits underneath this entire story like a stone under still water. How do you split a man in half and have both halves feel whole? The answer, as it turned out, was that you don't. Not really. You just get very good at making sure the 2 halves never have a reason to meet. And for nearly 8 years, Thomas Carter's system held. He kept a small apartment in the city between both households, officially for convenience during overnight shifts, which gave him a plausible place to retreat to and a plausible excuse for the nights he genuinely couldn't be reached. Both Diane and Patricia occasionally noted, in ways that never quite added up to suspicion, that Thomas seemed distracted sometimes, protective of his phone in a way that felt more habitual than romantic. Diane once found a receipt from a diner in a town she didn't recognize and asked about it. Thomas said it was near the clinic. It was, technically, true. She let it go, the way people let things go when the alternative feels unthinkable. The night that ended all of it began like nothing at all. Thomas had told Diane he was staying at the city apartment because of an early surgical consult. He had told Patricia something similar, about needing to be near the hospital for an overnight case. Both were, in a sense, true, because the apartment existed and he really did intend to be near the hospital. What neither woman knew was that he'd stepped outside that apartment sometime after 11 at night, and that a car, driven by someone who has never been identified to this day, struck him crossing the street and did not stop. A neighbor heard the impact and called it in. Paramedics found Thomas Carter unconscious on the pavement, no wallet visible, his phone screen shattered, unable to tell anyone in the ambulance who he was or who should be called. It took hospital staff nearly 4 hours to identify him, through his medical license badge, still clipped to the inside pocket of his coat. Once they did, 2 phone calls went out almost simultaneously, to 2 different emergency contacts, in 2 different states, both listed under the same relationship. Wife. Diane got in her car within minutes. Patricia, closer by an hour, arrived first. Neither woman knew the other had been called. Neither woman knew, walking through those hospital doors, that the person sitting a few chairs away in the waiting room was about to become the single most important stranger of her entire life. For nearly 2 hours, they sat near each other, both frightened, both assuming the other was a coworker or a distant relative, before a doctor finally asked the question that broke everything open at once. What followed in that hallway has been described by hospital staff who witnessed it as unlike anything they'd seen in their careers. Not shouting, not a scene, just silence, the specific kind of silence that happens when 2 people are doing the same math in their heads at the same time and arriving at the same impossible answer. Diane recalls in the only statement she's ever given publicly that Patricia said her husband's name first, and it matched. Then she said how long they'd been married, and the number didn't match anything Diane understood about her own life, because by Patricia's count, Thomas had been her husband for 7 years, which meant he had been someone else's husband for all 7 of those years without either of them knowing it. Thomas Carter, the only person who could have explained any of it, remained unconscious in a bed 30 feet away, entirely unaware his 2 lives had just collided in a hospital corridor without his permission. He never woke up enough to explain himself. 3 weeks later, without regaining consciousness, Dr. Thomas Carter died from complications related to his injuries. And here is where you'd expect this story to end, tragically but simply. A man living a double life, killed in an accident, his secrets exposed too late for him to answer for them. 2 women left to grieve a version of him that had never fully existed for either one. That would have been a hard story. It would not have been the story that actually happened. Because once the shock wore off, once the funeral arrangements were argued over by 2 women who'd never met before that hallway, a much colder question emerged. One that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with money, property, and who, legally, had the right to call themselves his widow. Under state law, only one marriage could be recognized. If Diane's marriage was still valid, and the divorce Thomas had shown Patricia never actually existed, then Diane stood to inherit everything: the house, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, and Patricia's marriage would be declared legally void, meaning she would walk away with nothing beyond whatever bank accounts had her own name on them. Patricia's attorney argued that regardless of paperwork, she had lived as his wife for years and deserved consideration. A judge reviewed both marriage certificates and, crucially, requested the divorce decree Thomas had allegedly filed before marrying Patricia. It did not exist. Court clerks in Diane and Thomas's home state confirmed no divorce had ever been finalized between them. Legally, only one marriage had ever been real, and it wasn't Patricia's. The ruling should have ended the story there, a sad, strange chapter, closed by a judge's gavel. 2 families left to rebuild separately. Instead, it lit a fuse inside Thomas Carter's own family that nobody outside it saw coming. Thomas had a younger brother named Gregory, who had never liked Diane, going back to disagreements over their parents' estate years earlier that had nothing to do with any of this. Gregory believed, with a conviction that alarmed even people who knew how much he disliked Diane, that Patricia and her children deserved the inheritance instead, and that the court had gotten it wrong. He said as much, loudly, at more than one family gathering in the weeks after the ruling. Most people who heard him chalked it up to grief curdling into anger, the kind of ugly talk families sometimes produce when money and mourning collide. Nobody thought it meant anything more than that. They were wrong. 4 months after the court's decision, on an ordinary evening outside her own home, Diane Carter was shot multiple times by 2 men she had never seen before in her life. She survived, barely, with injuries that would keep her hospitalized for weeks and change the shape of her daily life permanently. Police treated it initially as a possible robbery gone wrong, a random and horrifying act of violence in an otherwise quiet neighborhood. It took investigators several more weeks, working through phone records and financial transfers, to connect the 2 men who fired the shots to a payment that had come from an account belonging to Gregory Carter. He had, according to prosecutors, hired the men specifically to kill his own sister-in-law, over an inheritance dispute that a courtroom had already settled months earlier. The brother of the man whose double life started this entire story had tried to finish it with a bullet. Gregory Carter was arrested within weeks and eventually convicted of attempted murder and conspiracy, sentenced to decades in prison for a plot investigators described as deliberate, funded, and entirely premeditated. Diane Carter survived, though she has said publicly that survival is a strange word for what she lives with now, the caution that never fully leaves a person who has been hunted in front of her own home. Patricia, for her part, has largely stayed out of public view since the ruling, raising her children with whatever version of the truth she's decided they're ready for, at whatever age they're ready to hear it. And Thomas Carter, the man at the center of all of it, is buried under a headstone that only one of the 2 women he married had the legal right to choose. To this day, the driver who struck Thomas Carter on that street corner and never stopped has never been identified. No arrest was ever made. No plate number was ever confirmed. It remains, officially, an unsolved hit and run, one small unanswered piece, sitting quietly underneath a story that eventually grew so much larger than that single moment of impact. Some who followed the case have wondered, without any evidence to support it, whether that accident was really an accident at all, or whether it was simply the first domino in a chain nobody could have predicted, set off by a stranger who has never had to answer for it. We may never know. What we do know is that a single collision on an ordinary night ended one life and exposed two others, and set in motion a chain of consequences that very nearly ended a third. So here's the question I want to leave you with, because I think it's the one this entire case actually revolves around. It's easy to look at Thomas Carter and call him the villain of this story, and in many ways he clearly was. But the people left standing in the wreckage he built, Diane and Patricia, were both, in their own way, exactly what he needed them to be. Trusting, loyal, willing to give a quiet, dependable man the benefit of the doubt for years at a time. That isn't a character flaw. It's what a good marriage is supposed to require. And that's what makes this case so hard to sit with. The very qualities that make someone a good partner are the exact qualities a man like Thomas Carter needed in order to disappear in plain sight for the better part of a decade. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think really happened on that street corner the night Thomas Carter was hit, and whether you believe Gregory's plot was really about money or about something older and uglier that had been sitting in that family for years before any of this started. Let me know down in the comments, because I read every single one, and on a case this layered, I think you all usually end up piecing together something I hadn't considered myself. If this is the kind of story you want more of, told slowly and carefully instead of rushed for a quick upload, that's exactly what this channel exists for. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Until then, be careful how well you think you really know the people closest to you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.